Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and along with a fabulous team at the CMO Group, we bring you the most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership. Today, our guest is a repeat offender of the podcast, my former teacher and now my research partner, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. Upon graduating from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Mark served in the Army for 38 years before becoming a leadership scholar. Presently, Mark is a professor of practice and leadership at the Crummer School of Business at Rollins College here in Central Florida. Mark's most recent accomplishment is the publication of If I Don't Return, a father's wartime journal. When Mark, who was a major at the time, deployed to Iraq in 1990 as the operations officer of an armored cavalry squadron, his unit was told 50% of them would likely sustain casualties. To him, that meant he might not return home and perhaps never see his family again. To prepare for that potential outcome, he began keeping a journal, hoping that one day, if he didn't return, his stories and wisdom would be passed to his two young sons. In an Army-issued green notebook, Mark began recording his thoughts and hopes for his boys. He wrote of character, leadership, cultural differences, love, fear, and all the things he wanted his boys to know about him and his experiences. In unfiltered, handwritten entries, Hertling captured the reality of Operation Desert Storm, and what began as a father's private messages has since become a rare chronicle of life, leadership, and love with this new book. Mark, welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast.
Hey, Lee, first of all, it's great to be with you on the podcast, but it's just great to be with you again. It's been a long time since we've seen each other.
It has been too long. So I'll start with congratulating you, but not on the book. Congratulations on finally publishing your dissertation. So, yeah, exactly. It's been
6 years later.
Yeah. And you may not realize how much of that work had an impact on me, influenced me. And you were my former teacher, and now we're research partners. Yeah. So I think that tells the listeners a little bit about our relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And you were one of the three people that pushed me to publish the thing, and it was painful to try and squeeze it into a publishable document.
No good deed goes unpunished, They say. So, and here we are. I'd like for you to share with the listeners what you did with that research and where that's available for reading now.
Yeah, well, it was a end of a Doctor of Business Administration program that I had to think of a topic to research. And I knew the topic going in because I had been conducting, as you know, classes on healthcare leadership to doctors, nurses, and administrators, something that I was asked to do when I worked at a large healthcare organization here in Orlando, and wanted to prove what we had found. It was interesting because I took it to two other hospitals and had a thesis of having all doctors in one class and a mix of doctors, nurses, and administrators, interprofessional organizations in another class. And the thesis was that both of them would improve in their leadership skills, but the ones that were together in that interprofessional course would improve better. And that showed itself through 4 different courses in a significant way. I published and defended the dissertation in 2019 at the Crummer School of Business at Rollins College here in Orlando. And for the next 4 or 5 years, it kind of laid on the shelf after I published it and got my doctorate degree. But you and 2 other people kept pushing me to get it published. And over the last 6 months, I've split it up into different segments on the advice of the Physician Leadership Journal. And it's been published in a series with different topic areas. So it's been fun to see that come up every month since last June.
That's a great way to do that. Put that out in small bites and share the key elements of it. What were some of the key changes that you observed from the students in the course?
Well, it was a mixed method study, Lee, which every doctoral student tries to avoid. It's the bane of investigations, but it studied not only the quantitative results of how did things measure up over 20 different leadership traits that we were measuring, and it was not only the self-efficacy, physicians and nurses reporting on themselves how they thought they improved over an 8-month period of time. But each one of those also had a peer nurse, a peer doctor, and a peer administrator who was not in the course, as well as their spouse or partner who reported on changes in their styles with communication, team building, conflict resolution, those kind of things. So the thesis was that the improvements in those areas make for a better leader. But what was interesting is one of the hospitals I was working with, and this was the article that just came out this month in Physician Leadership Journal, asked me if I could add some more questions to the surveys we were using pre and post. And those questions surrounded burnout. And it was interesting because, as all doctoral students will tell you, they don't want anybody expanding their research because it just causes more pain. But because they asked me to do it, I included some questions from the studies by Maslach, who's a big burnout expert. And what we saw, even though resiliency, burnout, those kind of things were never mentioned in the class, those also improved in terms of self-thought, self-efficacy by each one of the participants. And the conclusion was that when you study leadership and you feel a little bit more connection to the organization, which you and I worked on in another research paper, it tends to reduce the kinds of things that create burnout or a lack of resiliency in your profession.
Yeah, I fully support and agree with that notion that you found in the work and that you and I did together. There's no doubt that whatever field we're talking about, burnout involves about 6 or 7 or 8 different frames by which burnout occurs. One of those is the separation of purpose, mastery, and agency. And if you think of 3 overlapping circles, and in the center you feel at your core fulfillment, but when those circles pull apart and that Venn diagram goes outward, you lose your agency, you lose your purpose, you lose your mastery. The feelings of burnout occur. And when you develop people, it seems very obvious that you help them regain a sense of purpose, why they're there, what they're doing there. They begin to master new skills, and they feel that agency again.
Well, and they also reflect on their values.
Yeah.
They reflect on others as opposed to themselves. What am I doing wrong versus how do I help make this team better? So all those things, it makes perfect sense.
Right.
And it was interesting. I'll share this with you. My thesis advisor, a woman by the name of Kim Yentz, PhD, she's a big organizational design student, but her father was a physician. And when we came back with these things we couldn't explain, why did these things change when we didn't address burnout or resiliency? She said, it's pretty simple to understand. You're giving a person an understanding of their worth within the organization by giving them help to be courageous leaders. So it does make sense.
It does. And when you and I started working together, first you were my teacher and I was a student in the leadership development interprofessional course that you led. Someone came up to me and said at the end of the course, I just want to let you know, I've been with this organization for a very, very long time. And after this course, I believe I can finally trust the organization.
Yeah. How about that?
And you remember that was an epiphanal moment for me. And I began to think about this. Did this work generate a trusting relationship or a more trustworthiness of the organization to the participants?
Yeah.
And that's what you and I studied the first time. And we found that students after leadership development, nurses, administrators, and physicians, that they felt a stronger organizational commitment and attitudes towards the organization by the end of the course. And that was the first of our research partnerships. You remember that, of course.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and what I'll share with you on that, it's by design. I mean, as you remember, the course was set up that the first 2 months focused on self, the next 2 months focused on teams, and then the last 2 months focused on organization, both what healthcare providers can provide to the organization and what the organization does for them. And, trust is the essence of leadership. It all reverts back to trust, in every single one of those areas. And one of the things I'll mention too, Lee, is the whole concept, and I'm seeing this as I'm teaching MBA students now too, that there is a universal admittance of imposter syndrome. And that's something I'm looking at right now. What creates that? Well, that's I think it comes by the fact that you don't have enough confidence in yourself because you haven't reflected on who you are as much as you should. And what we see is, as people go through these kinds of leadership trainings, they begin to generate a lot of courage, an understanding of what they really believe in and how they influence teams.
And that ties in nicely with our second project, which will be published later this year, where we talked about, well, what if we take students from all over the United States and put them in an isolated environment instead of their host healthcare organization and provide leadership development for them. And they're already advanced physician leaders. They've been in a formal role for at least 5 years. And we asked them similar questions as we did the first time relative to organizational attitudes and commitments and self-efficacy. And we learned that you get the same, if not more demonstrable results, that when you develop people, give them courage, give them a sense of worth, give them some agency. And those are conjectures on my part, but that there is improvement in their attitudes towards their home organization that had nothing to do with the leadership development. The point being, you can take physicians and other healthcare leaders, develop them, and you can have measurable changes in who they are and what they can do. What do you think really drives those shifts? Is it the didactic that you give? Is it the information that you give? Or is it more of that self-awareness?
By far, it's the self-awareness. I have no magic sauce emanating from me. It's just guiding people to become aware of who they are and how they interact with others.
Yeah.
And that's, it's interesting. You go around to different organizations that have leadership programs, and they all have dynamics of getting to yes or negotiating through conflict. You can do all those things if you have a better understanding of who the hell you are and who you're working with. And that's what I find so much fun about studying leadership, because it is a dynamic that you can't say, apply this technique to that particular thing and everything is going to be okay, because everyone's different. You're dealing with human nature.
And that's an area that I'm exploring right now very actively. And you and I have talked about our next project. Physicians are trained for years. A plus B equals C. There's cause and effect. An intervention will lead to a result. And that is not necessarily the same as leadership, to your point. And you have to begin to think differently about how you conduct yourself to get the leadership results as opposed to the cause and effect results.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I'll add to that, because one of my mentors in healthcare is Dr. Dave Moorhead, who is now retired too. But, what he told me one time, and it really made a big impression, was that doctors are taught the science of medicine. They are not taught the art of leadership. And
that's correct.
They're two different things, because science is a wonderful dynamic, but sometimes A does not equal B. And it's when you're dealing with human nature, right?
Yeah. Yeah. If you cannot navigate the messiness of human behavior, you will struggle in leadership.
Right.
That, I think, has been proven. So let's talk about your work at Rollins College.
Yeah.
What are you doing there, and what are you teaching at the school?
An interesting dynamic, if I can make a short story a little long. About 3 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, a new dean came into Rollins. And this dean, I had just graduated. I was doing adjunct work, part-time stuff. And this new dean came in from the business community. And he was a private sector kind of guy, had not been in academia all that much. And he said, his experiences in business was that we are doing a good job in business schools and teaching what we just talked about, the science of marketing or finance or, operations strategy. He says, but we're not doing anything with regard to the character of our businessmen. And women. We've got to improve their leadership. We've got to improve their understanding of ethics and social responsibility. So he closed down the MBA program for a year and wanted to completely revamp it. He stopped. We had admissions ready to go the following year, and he stopped it for an entire year and asked us to rewrite the course. And one of the other professors said, hey, if you really want to talk leadership, you ought to pull this guy Hertling in, because all of us business professors know marketing and finance and economy, but we don't know leadership, so pull this guy in. So he asked me to write several courses. And so far I've written 5 that are mandatory courses. We start off with the foundations of leadership, then talk about strategic leadership, how you evolve from the basic foundations to the strategic level. Then he asked me to put together something we're calling the CEO Academy, which really is, we treat all of these MBA students as aspiring CEOs, which some of them are, not all of them. But we say, okay, what kind of decisions do you have to make when you're at the top of the food chain? And it's sort of what you're doing with chief medical officers. And then finally, I talked him into doing a battle staff ride of Gettysburg, which we just did 2 weeks ago. And where we assign each one of the students a general, North and South, from the Civil War, take them to the Battle of Gettysburg, and then do what the military calls a staff ride, where we talk about not button collector Civil War history, but leadership decision-making in a crisis. And we translate things like toxic leadership from the Civil War to today, positions on the battlefield to most influence the action to position in your organization, how communication can cause failure or huge success, those kinds of things. And there's about 50 subjects that we cover, and we do it in a day and a half. And we came away 2 weeks ago. It's the first time I've done it with MBA students. As you know, I did it with doctors, and they loved it too. But I had one student come up to me and say, that was a religious experience.
Wow.
I walked away completely understanding what we have been through and how all this MBA stuff comes together in a real method to run an organization the right way.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
When you and I worked together, we did that equivalent at the Kennedy Space Center, talking about human and manned space flight and all of the variables, and the key objective of the mission is to bring the astronauts home safely.
And we talked about when things go wrong too,
Right.
like the Columbia disaster.
Right.
And we saw how that affected an organization too.
And I know personally, and you do too, that the physicians were equally affected by that experience and thinking about.
Yeah, and I think it became part of the reason why is because we did that course, and the first time we went to Kennedy was right after COVID.
Yes.
So they had seen traumatic experiences and how catastrophe will affect an organization, and how leadership steps up to overcome that.
And if you are unprepared, and I know you love preparation, crisis will define you.
Yep.
One way or the other.
Exactly.
So, one of the things I did want to ask you, a few weeks ago, we were talking, and it may be in relation to your ongoing work with physician leadership. I know you're working with a system up in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about context. You've begun to add context into your curriculum.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can share with us about what bubbled up in your mind and why you brought that in?
Well, it gets right into your wheelhouse. You're setting me up for this, I can tell.
I
And
know.
by the way, that organization in Virginia is run by a guy who went through the course with you, who left your organization and took over a new position, another one. So that was a changing context for him.
Right.
And he's a great guy. I won't mention his name, Chris Stone, but a wonderful leader and a great individual who wanted to bring that to a new organization. But yeah, the 4 elements of leadership that are found in research, and that I didn't realize until I started studying versus executing leadership, was it's something we ignore in the military. We do it, but we ignore preparing for it. And that is the 4 elements are your leader's attributes, your leader's competencies, how the leader influences and inspires other people. And then the 4th element is context. And what's meant by that is in the first 3, you can feel like you're studying and you're really doing it great and everything's going well. But then suddenly your job changes and the context of your leadership changes, whether it's a result of the organization's culture, what is expected of you moving up into a new position, the kinds of dynamics you had to never face before as a leader that all changed the way you do leadership. So that context element is, you're talking to a bunch of aspiring CMOs,
Right.
or CMOs who have been in the job. They've gone from the clinical world to suddenly the leadership management role. the context has changed.
Yes.
So what worked as a doctor in the clinic may not work as a doctor in a C-suite role as part of the organization. So that's what that context is all about.
Yeah. And I spend a lot of time now thinking about and researching that transformation that's required in that contextual change of environment.
Yeah.
What got you here won't get you there.
Right.
I think Marshall Goldsmith. You have to learn new approaches and expand the way you do things as you go into different roles.
Well, the Army does a pretty good job of it, but it's transparent. I started my career as a second lieutenant tanker with 19 soldiers under my command in a tank platoon in Europe in 1975 to show how old I am. 30 some odd years later, I'm now the commanding general of US Army Europe, where I have 60,000 soldiers, all different kinds of organizations besides tanks, logistics and intelligence and medical. So that just is an indicator of how you change from the early part of your career to the late part of your career. And what I didn't recognize that whole 35 years of doing this was that every time I went back to school or every time I took a new assignment, people were adding things to my rucksack.
Yeah.
And it made it transparent that I was understanding context without understanding context. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tongue twister.
Yeah.
Well, I want to bring up your first publication, which was Growing Physician Leaders.
Yeah.
And in that, you use some of that military experience to drive some of the leadership lessons relative to physician leadership growth. And in your current book, If I Don't Return, A Father's Wartime Journal, you do a similar approach, but much more unique by drawing on your military experience, your work at Crummer, and the work you've done in physician leadership to really hit home on key elements of leadership. So would you share with everyone the really fascinating origin at Christmas of how this book came to be?
Well, if I can start by saying Growing Physician Leaders was a fun book to write because the organization I was working for asked me to write it after the physician leader course, but it was hard. It followed, as I think I've told some people, I once heard that Hemingway defined the 3 M's of book writing, and they are, at first, it's your mistress because you love writing it. Secondly, it becomes your master because you have to edit and do all the other things. And then finally, when you think it's about ready to publish, it becomes a monster, and you never get it out the door until it finally happens. This book, If I Don't Return, was not at all like that.
Right.
It was a true joy from start to now. And it came about briefly back in the 1990s when I was a young major. I was going to Desert Storm. And when we were told we were going to Desert Storm, I was in a cavalry unit, which is responsible for reconnaissance outside of in front of the division. And we were given the intelligence that we would probably suffer 50% casualties. And that was because the army we were going against at the time, we didn't know much about, but Saddam Hussein had the 4th largest army in the world. He had just fought an 8-year war against Iran. He had used chemicals against his own people. So we thought, the intelligence community thought that it would be a tough fight. Mm-hmm. It proved not to be. But going into it, when we were told that, I thought, oh my gosh, I've got a 50% chance of coming home. And Sue and I have 2 young boys. They were 7 and 10 at the time. So if I die, if I leave her a widow and the kids fatherless, how do I want them to grow up? What kind of things do I want them to know that I won't be here to teach them? So on a daily basis, before the war started, we deployed to Saudi Arabia. We were sitting in the sands of the desert. I started a journal, a daily journal, not a diary per se, but I would pick a different subject every day and just write about it. Say, here's how you boys need to think about this. Then when we got into the war, I wasn't writing every day for the 4-day combat that we had in Desert Storm, ground combat. But I wrote at the end of that what had occurred over those 4 days and the different things that happened. And then the 3rd section of the book is all about what happened after the ceasefire for the couple of months we were there afterwards. And all of these were lessons that I wanted the boys to know. But the spoiler alert, I did come home. The other spoiler alert is a 7 and 10-year-old were still there, and they had no desire to see the musing of their dad during the 6 months or 8 months that I was away. So the journal, the handwritten journal, went into a footlocker, never to emerge until our youngest son asked my wife about it and said, "Hey, where's that journal?" And now our youngest son is now 42. He served a couple of combat tours himself, so is our older son. But what he did was, while doing a very difficult job that is part of his professional life and handling 2 sons of his own and trying to raise them well, he spent time after the kids went to bed typing the journal up. And Christmas morning of 2024, he handed it to me in a box and said, "Dad, this one's just for you. This is a present just for you." It was a Word document with everything I had written in that journal, along with pictures from the time that we had in a box. And then what he said was, "And Dad, you know, my brother and I realized why you were writing this. You were writing this in case you didn't come home." He said, "But now you have 5 grandsons. So continue the writing for them and teach them more lessons, because you had 35 more years to write about these things."
That's a beautiful story. And if you don't mind, I have a copy, my copy of the book. I'd like to read a few things for our listeners and ask you to make some comments. Is that okay?
Sure.
Reflection. Leadership, like war, is a cumulative endeavor. You don't arrive on the battlefield or at any new job with a blank slate. You bring everything with you: the training, the scars, the questions you asked, and the ones you were too afraid to ask. And if you're lucky, you bring the wisdom earned through experience and some of the scar tissue you've endured. Tell me about scars.
You know, there are some people, and I'm one of them, that believe that you sometimes learn a whole lot more from failures than you do from successes, because you're forced to look at them and analyze them and try and, if you're doing things right, you try and determine what you did wrong to cause that, or how you could have done it better. Those are what I call the scar tissues of life. And they're there. They shape your character. They define who you are. You know, Lee, one of the biggest things that affected my character was the fact that I was cut from my high school baseball team. Damn it, because I knew for sure that I was going to be an all-star first baseman for the St. Louis Cardinals someday. So that, you know, it really drives the fact that you have to look at yourself. And how do you pick yourself up? How do you figure out what you did right and wrong? How can you improve from that particular object? And then what do you do next? How do you handle it? Do you mope about it? Do you kick dirt? Do you kick sand and complain about it at the end of the bar when you're 50 years removed from the event? No, you try and pick up something else and be successful in some other arena.
There was a very well-known book in certain circles back in the 80s that helped me through some tough times in my life, written by Rabbi Harold Kushner. And it's entitled When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Yeah.
And I read the whole book waiting for the answer, and it as though there was some philosophical answer. And the rabbi ends by stating, this question cannot be answered. What only matters is what you do when the bad things happen.
Yeah.
And it, again, defines your character and how you face the world.
A key trait of leadership is learning and growing every day.
You bet. You bet. Here's another passage, and this is about trust and leadership, as we talked about. As someone who is a student of leaders in the private sector, I'm convinced that trust is the building block of relationships, leadership, and life. Trust is gained in myriad ways, and as I once heard someone say, trust is earned in drops but lost in buckets. Trust is relatively easy to build in small teams if one knows what it takes to build it, but it is much harder to sustain when hidden motives, blind spots, egos, and personal agendas that are often present in larger teams enter the equation. And you go on to quote a military theoretician, Karl von Clausewitz, who describes something similar in broader terms for warfare. He wrote of war as a paradoxical trinity, a balance of passion, chance, and reason that found its practical expression in the relationship between the government, its army, and its people. Each had to trust the other. Citizens had to believe their government's cause was just. Armies had to believe their political leaders would use their sacrifices wisely, and governments had to trust their soldiers to execute with discipline and competence. What is that all about?
Well, the Clausewitzian Trinity is something that a few of us spent over a year studying at an advanced school when we were majors out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And what it really talks about is how each one of those elements in combat can't act alone. You can't have an extremely competent army without having a government that the people trust. You can't have an extremely competent army if the people don't trust the army and they think they're doing bad things. It is that trilogy of passion, executing missions that the Army does, logic, what the government asks of its soldiers and of its people, and reason. And by the way, Clausewitz wasn't the first to figure that out. I think a guy named Aristotle said something about logos, ethos, and pathos. And it's the same thing, the combination of logic, passion, and reason.
Yeah. Well, I want to draw a parallel, and I want your reaction to this as it relates to healthcare and our chief medical officers, our administrators who listen to our show. I would say that this trinity is very much true. Patients have to believe that their hospitals and their clinics, that their mission to heal is of the highest integrity, and that physicians and nurses have to believe that the healthcare leadership will use the resources wisely day in and day out. And the leadership must believe that the doctors and nurses would be disciplined and competent in their care of the patients. As physicians become organizational leaders, they move farther from the bedside, but they really do need to understand that trinity plays itself out day in and day out.
And as those physicians move into those positions farther from the bedside, they become the interlocutors and the bridging mechanism between the people and the administrators and the patient. And I think that was written by Dr. Peter von Clausewitz later on. He was Karl's brother, I believe. Yeah. But all the things that are said in this, I mean, Clausewitz wrote for combat. I mean, he was one of Napoleon's scribes. But a lot of the things he says in his work on war is really about on life.
Yeah.
And that's a great translation to the healthcare community.
Well, the other thing that happens is leadership, and I'm going to quote again from your book, leadership is lonely work, but it doesn't have to be solitary if you have people around you who understand both your responsibilities and your humanity and continuously remind leaders that they cannot carry burdens alone. Expand on that, particularly the comment about your humanity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm smiling because I just taught that lesson last week to my MBA students, and I call it the stuff rucksack theory. Mm-hmm. That's my personal theory, and that's your bosses go around with a rucksack. Many people don't know what that is, a big backpack, and it's stuffed full of things that he or she has to do, and the subordinates have to understand that leader, that man or woman who's leading the organization, has an awful lot on their plate. And when you ask them to put more in that rucksack, you as a subordinate, you as a follower have to help out quite a bit. And that's understanding, or what some people call leading up. Because if you're just throwing new ideas at that man or woman who's leading the organization, they don't have time for new ideas unless they get some help. That's human nature.
Right.
So it's an important part of leadership, and it's the humanity of being alone as the senior most person in the organization.
The higher you go, the farther away from the bedside you get. That's what we say in healthcare.
Yep.
And a lot of us go into medicine to be at the bedside,
yeah.
And it's a tough transition. Well, if you don't mind, there's one last passage I'm going to ask you to read here on the bottom of page 304 between these two arrows.
I sometimes can't read this because I get choked up, but
you got your readers right here.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a beautiful section, and it sums up a lot about what you wrote and who you are. Written 35 years after putting it in the Green Journal, you wrote a little bit more of a letter. So would you read where
this was part of the reflections on a journal entry, and it says, "To my grandchildren, you were the audience I didn't know I would have." This is going to be tough. If you find yourself reading these pages, know this: you come from a family that believes that service is joy, that truth and humor walk together. Sorry about this, Lee. And that every person you meet deserves fairness, respect, and dignity. The world will tell you that winning is the point. It is not. The point is to be good and to do good together for as long as you are given breath. Yeah, thanks for doing that to me, Lee.
Well, I warned you we might go to some place that would be a little touchy, but I wanted to bring that up because I want to share my own thoughts with you and with the listeners. We've devoted a lot of time to this podcast and grown a great listener base relative to healthcare and physician leadership. And you didn't have those thoughts in 1990 around the grandchildren. You were focused on the objectives, the mission, and your boys and Sue. Experts tell us that we form feelings before the words and the thoughts emerge.
Yeah.
And this is the wisdom that emerges from experience and scars. This book is about love in the form of love letters home and a special type of love related to leadership. Your reflections illuminate a type of love first described by the ancient Greeks, Aristotle perhaps, as agape, representing selfless, unconditional, and sacrificial love, exhibited in the acts of fostering compassion, community service, and unconditional care for others. If you want to jump in, go for it, but I have one last thought to add to that.
I will jump in because after a 4 decades long military career, by serendipity, I was asked to join a healthcare organization. And I think I've shared this with you before, but I'm going to do it again. What I realized after serving a couple of years with a large organization and seeing what doctors and nurses and administrators and all the people that support them do is it was an awful lot like being with soldiers. It is a profession. It is one of 2 professions of many within our society, but we are, medicine and the military, the only 2 professions that deal in life and death in very, very different ways. So you have to earn your right as a professional to do the kinds of things both healthcare providers and soldiers do. And it takes an awful lot to get there. And I think I've learned that more and more as I've gotten older. And what you've just realized is what I say in the first chapter of the book is that my wife sometimes says I cry at supermarket openings. I get emotional because I see the very value in every human being, the shining spark that is in every soul.
I've known you a number of years. I wish I've known you longer. And Sue is right. And I always trust Sue. She knows you and she hits the nail on the head. Let me wrap my thoughts with the following. Much as soldiering, swearing an oath to protect the Constitution and leading soldiers, this is also true in medicine. The choice to become a physician and take an oath in the service of others, to address suffering unconditionally with sacrifice and selflessness in the act of caring for other people. To me, physician leadership is about fostering compassion, community service, and unconditional love for the house of medicine and all who dwell in it. So those are my final thoughts. Your final thoughts, Mark, before we wrap up?
It has been, a true pleasure doing this simple little podcast with you, Lee, but it's also been an honor to become your friend over the last couple of years and see what you're doing to continue the efforts of physicians and healthcare providers in a very important profession in our society.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about love and leadership with our listeners. And you're a repeat offender, which means we probably have to bring you on another time.
Hope so.
All right. Thanks, Mark. That was great.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. Want to learn more about how to develop physicians into leaders? Then connect with either one of us on LinkedIn. Want to learn more about transforming your career and becoming a CMO? Then connect with the CMO group and get ready to lead in healthcare. I love talking with those dedicated to leadership from all around the world, especially those supporting physician leadership. So get out there, develop your physicians, your nurses, your administrators, and damn it, do some good together.